They were told she was a mother, but she owned children who weren't hers. In the parlor, she wore the face of virtue, her voice soft and tempered with the kind of gentle authority the town admired. She was the model of piety, the keeper of the home, the one who tended to every corner of domestic life with care and grace. She read the Bible aloud in the evenings, organized charitable visits for the sick, and was seen as a guiding hand for the moral upbringing of the young. Yet, behind the shutters of her home and the latticework of the veranda, she commanded a world in which the smallest of children could be property, bought, sold, punished, and rewarded at her will. In the antebellum South, the public imagination painted white women as the innocent counterparts to the brutality of their husbands, as though they were simply passengers in a system driven by men. But the reality was far more complex. While the men oversaw the fields, managed the accounts, and negotiated sales, it was often the women who ruled the intimate spaces, kitchens, nurseries, laundry rooms, and bedrooms, where the lives of enslaved black children unfolded. She did not just see them, she shaped them. She taught them when to speak and when to remain silent, which tasks to perform and how to perform them, what to fear and who to obey. From the earliest years, these children knew her footsteps, light, deliberate, and decisive. They knew the rustle of her skirts meant either a rare moment of praise or the sharp edge of her displeasure. To outsiders, her presence in the nursery was the mark of care. In truth, it was also the mark of control. The same hands that guided her own children through the first wobbly steps and taught them their letters could, in another moment, grip the ear of a black child hard enough to bring tears, or order a punishment that left a bruise hidden beneath clothing. For many enslaved children, she was the first white authority figure they came to know. She set the rhythms of their day. The morning began with her instructions: who would help in the kitchen, who would be sent to fetch water, who would sweep the floors, and who would stay in the yard to watch the younger ones. Meals were distributed at her discretion. Seconds were rare and often given as rewards for obedience. She could decide that a child would eat later, or not at all, for some small act of defiance, real or imagined. The contradiction was sharp and cruel. She could coo at her own child's scraped knee while ordering an enslaved child with the same injury back to work. To her, there was no conflict in these actions. She saw herself as both protector and disciplinarian, a figure who believed her dominance over these children was natural, even benevolent, as long as the household ran as she wished. She could justify punishment as instruction, deprivation as moral training, and separation from parents as necessary for the smooth operation of the estate. The weight of her authority was heaviest in the earliest years of life. Babies born into slavery often came under her notice within hours of their birth. While their mothers recovered, these infants might be brought into the house to be fed by another enslaved woman, washed, or simply inspected. Some were kept close, raised alongside her own children as playmates, though this closeness never erased the boundaries of ownership. A child might be cherished for their quietness, their quickness to learn, or their pleasing manners, but this affection was conditional and could vanish without warning. Ownership was not always a matter of chains or sales contracts. It was a matter of constant, unquestioned control. She decided who could visit the quarters to see their parents and when. She determined what these children wore, often giving them the worn clothes of her own children. Sometimes she named them. In the records, there are countless examples of enslaved children carrying the surnames or nicknames given to them by the women who owned them. This was not kindness. It was branding, a subtle way to assert the child's place as part of her property, her household, her will. The children learned early that her moods could determine the course of a day. A good mood might mean lighter work, a sweet treat from the kitchen, or an evening without scolding. A bad mood could bring chores doubled, the sting of a slap, or the humiliation of being punished in front of others. Her anger did not always require a reason. Sometimes, it was enough that a child reminded her of their mother or carried the features of a father she disliked. To the outside world, she was a woman fulfilling her God-given role, guiding young souls, keeping order in the home, and ensuring the next generation grew up with discipline and respect. But in the quiet corners of the plantation house, her authority was a constant presence in the lives of enslaved children. She could grant small mercies, but she could just as easily withhold them. Her word could place a child in the relative safety of the kitchen or consign them to harder labor in the fields. And while men were the ones who signed the bills of sale, she often influenced the decisions. She could suggest that a troublesome child be sent away to another plantation. She could arrange for a favored one to stay close, to serve in the dining room, or to assist in the sewing room. Her power over enslaved children was not loud, but it was persistent, shaping their bodies, their habits, and their sense of self long before they reached adulthood. In the story of slavery, it is easy to imagine the brutality as a male act, whips cracked by overseers, deals made in the marketplace. But the home was its own theater of control, and the women who ran it were not passive bystanders. They were the daily face of slavery for the youngest, the ones who taught its lessons before a child was old enough to understand the system they were born into. To the world, she might have been called a mother. To the children she owned, she was something else entirely, a presence they could not escape, whose approval could mean a brief moment of comfort and whose disfavor could shape the course of their lives. The contradiction sat at the heart of her identity. She could rock a cradle with one hand and sign an order for punishment with the other. She could quote scripture about kindness and charity, then ensure a child spent the night hungry. She could insist she was raising these children for their own good while never forgetting, or letting them forget, that they were hers to command. This duality was not an accident of history. It was the very design of the system, one in which motherhood and ownership could exist in the same breath. And in the lives of countless enslaved black children, that breath shaped everything. Plantation life was built on a hierarchy so rigid that it could survive even in the absence of its most visible authority. When the men rode out to oversee the fields or traveled to settle accounts in town, the order of the household did not falter. It was held in place by the women, not merely as keepers of domestic peace, but as the daily enforcers of its rules, especially over the children who lived under their roof. In the closed world of the plantation home, the mistress's word carried the weight of law. Her authority seeped into every hour of the day, touching every small life within reach. The rules she made were not written on paper or nailed to the wall. They were woven into the rhythm of existence. Breakfast might be served for her own children in fine china bowls, while the enslaved children received their portion from a wooden trough or tin plate. Feeding schedules were set not by hunger, but by her convenience, and they could shift without warning. She decided who ate first and who waited, who was given the scraps from the dining table, and who was sent to bed with little more than cornbread. The smallest acts, an extra biscuit slipped to a favored child or a skipped meal for one who had disobeyed, were her way of reinforcing the invisible lines between privilege and deprivation. In those long stretches when the men were absent, discipline was hers to administer. She didn't need a whip to maintain control. Her arsenal was subtler, though no less effective. A sharp word in front of others could sting just as much as a physical blow. A command to scrub floors until the skin on small hands cracked could be punishment enough to make obedience a habit. She could withhold rest, assign menial and repetitive chores, or order a child to stand silently in the corner for hours. For the youngest, the punishments might seem arbitrary, a delayed bedtime, a ban from playing in the yard, but they carried an unspoken warning. She had the power to make life harder at any moment. Proximity gave her this power. Unlike the overseer in the fields, whose authority was visible but distant, she lived among the children she commanded. She saw them when they woke, when they worked, when they whispered to each other in stolen moments. She could catch the look of defiance in an eye or the smallest hint of reluctance in a task. In her mind, these details were not trivial. They were signs to be corrected before they became problems. And because she was always near, correction could come instantly. The intimacy of this arrangement blurred lines in dangerous ways. Enslaved children might be called to serve as companions to her own children, to carry their books to lessons, or to fetch toys from another room. They might be told to sing to the baby when it cried, or rock the cradle when her hands were busy with embroidery. These small tasks placed them within her constant gaze, where every word, every movement could be evaluated. A smile could bring a brief kindness, a frown could mark them for punishment. Even the milestones of their young lives fell under her jurisdiction. A girl reaching adolescence might find her duties suddenly shifted from light chores in the house to more taxing labor in the fields, a decision she could make without consultation. A boy deemed capable of heavier work might be sent to the stables or workshops, not by the master's decree, but by hers. And when it came to the question of marriage among the enslaved, her influence could be decisive. She could approve a union if it served the needs of the household, perhaps pairing two people whose combined labor would be most useful, or she could block it, separating couples before they began. Her decisions in these matters were often cloaked in the language of care. She might say that a child was not ready for certain responsibilities, or that it was better for a young woman to remain in the house rather than marry. But beneath such reasoning lay the unchanging truth. She acted to maintain control, to shape the lives of those she owned in ways that served her own comfort, her family's reputation, and the smooth running of the estate. The enslaved children understood that her power was not a temporary condition. It did not vanish when the master returned. If anything, her word carried more weight in the household than his, because it was she who knew every corner of their behavior. She remembered who had been obedient in her absence and who had faltered. She could speak for or against them when decisions about their future were made. This constant nearness bred a particular kind of fear, not the fear of sudden violence, but the fear of being watched without pause. Every action was measured against the unspoken rules she kept. Every slip of the tongue or moment of inattention could be noticed, remembered, and used to define a child standing in her eyes. In this way, she did not just enforce the rules, she became the rules. Her presence was the law in the home, as binding and as inescapable as the plantation gates themselves. To the outside world, she was the quiet force that kept the household running, a figure of refinement who ensured the smooth operation of daily life. But to the children under her rule, she was the constant, unyielding center of their world, the one who could grant a moment's ease or extend their suffering with a single word. She moved through their lives with the certainty of someone who believed her control was righteous, necessary, even natural. And in the spaces where no one else was watching, she shaped their futures in ways they could neither predict nor resist. In the plantation household, education was not a right, it was a tool, and it was wielded with precision. White women, as the daily arbiters of the domestic sphere, decided which skills an enslaved child would be allowed to learn, and which knowledge was too dangerous to grant. Their control over instruction was not merely practical, it was strategic, a way to shape obedience and prevent even the thought of resistance. The lessons they permitted were tailored to the needs of the estate. A young girl might be taught to sew, but only enough to mend clothes for the household, not to create garments she could sell for herself. She might be shown how to cook, but only under supervision, her recipes limited to what the mistress demanded for her table. A boy might be trained to polish silver or set a formal dining room, skills that served the master's hospitality but gave him no power beyond the front door. These instructions were framed as acts of generosity. "We are teaching her a trade," a mistress might say, but the trades were carefully chosen so they could never be used to gain independence. The forbidden lessons were far more telling. Reading and writing were among the most feared abilities an enslaved person could acquire. A letter could carry news between plantations, a note could arrange a meeting, a Bible could inspire ideas of freedom and equality. White women understood that words could move in silence, crossing barriers that no overseer's gate could contain. And so they became vigilant gatekeepers. Children seen with books were questioned immediately. Where did you get it? Who gave it to you? A scrap of paper with markings could be enough to spark suspicion. Even the act of looking over a white child's shoulder during a lesson could draw a sharp rebuke. "That's not for you," a mistress might say, snatching away the page. These moments were more than casual scolding. They were warnings. The household had boundaries, and knowledge was one of the firmest. Still, curiosity has a way of finding cracks in even the strongest walls. There were enslaved children who learned letters by tracing their fingers over the stitches in a hem, memorizing the shapes they had seen in passing. Some learned to read numbers by watching the tally of goods in the pantry ledger. A trusted older servant might whisper the alphabet during quiet chores, or a sympathetic white child might leave a primer behind by accident. Every letter learned in this way was a small act of defiance, a spark carried carefully so it would not be seen and stamped out. But discovery brought risk, swift, sometimes brutal. A child caught copying letters might have the paper burned before their eyes, the smell of singed parchment searing the lesson into memory. They could be denied meals, sent to the fields as punishment, or beaten in front of others to make the danger of such ambitions clear. In the worst cases, the punishment was not just physical but permanent. Reassignment to distant labor, separation from family, or a calculated increase in the most exhausting duties to crush the will to learn. The irony was bitter. In her own parlor, the mistress might speak warmly of education, praising the refinement it brought to her children. She might boast to visitors about the skills her daughters were acquiring in French or piano. Yet under the same roof, she would enforce an absolute silence over the minds of the enslaved. She knew that knowledge could rearrange the world, and that her place in it depended on keeping that rearrangement from happening. There were moments when the lines blurred, when the mistress's desire for efficiency tempted her to bend her own rules. An enslaved child with a sharp mind might be taught to keep basic household accounts or read simple instructions for sewing patterns. But even then, the lessons stopped at the edge of utility. The child could add numbers, but not write a letter. She could read the word spoon on an inventory, but not a verse in a hymn book. Every bit of permitted knowledge came with an invisible tether to keep it from becoming freedom. This control was as much about shaping identity as it was about preventing rebellion. To be told from the beginning that certain knowledge was not for you was to be reminded daily of one's place in the world. The mistress reinforced this not only with her words, but with her very presence in the schoolroom, at the sewing table, in the kitchen. She was there when lessons began and there when they ended, ensuring that no extra truth slipped through the cracks. Yet the desire to know could not be extinguished completely. In stolen moments, while sweeping the floor of the schoolroom, while folding the master's letters, while tending to the white children during lessons, some enslaved children gathered fragments of knowledge like crumbs. They carried these fragments quietly, guarding them from suspicion, piecing them together in secret until the letters formed words, and the words formed thoughts too large to speak aloud. For the mistress, control over education was not an afterthought. It was a cornerstone of her authority. By deciding who could learn and what they could learn, she could shape not just the skills of the children she owned, but the very limits of their imaginations. It was a power she exercised daily, with the calm assurance of someone who believed the world depended on her keeping those doors closed, and with the unspoken fear that, should those doors ever open, they could never be closed again. Punishment within the walls of the plantation home carried a different weight than the lash of the overseer's whip in the fields. It was quieter, hidden, and often more insidious. When the mistress of the house punished enslaved children, it was not for the world to see. These were private rituals of control, carried out behind closed doors, where the screams, if they came, would be muffled by thick plaster walls and heavy curtains. Inside the home, punishment could take many forms, and it rarely relied solely on brute force. Emotional cruelty was one of the mistress's sharpest tools. A child might be denied the comfort of their mother's presence, sent to sleep in a cold pantry or outbuilding as penance for some perceived disobedience. A favorite blanket or small possession could be taken away, not for its material value, but for the emotional sting of the loss. Even the meals could be manipulated. A child served plain bread and water while others ate meat and stew at the long table, the scent of it filling the air like a deliberate taunt. One of the most effective punishments was separation. If a child was judged too defiant, they could be removed from their parents entirely, reassigned to serve in another part of the estate, or even loaned to a relative's household miles away. The mistress might frame this as a necessary lesson, assuring herself that the child's absence would humble them into obedience. But for the child, it was an open wound, a sudden severing of the only anchor of familiarity in a life defined by servitude. Some punishments targeted the heart directly. A child might be made to stand silently in the corner of the parlor while their siblings or friends played, a living reminder that joy was a privilege they had been stripped of. Others were forced to serve their punishers in intimate ways, brushing the mistress's hair, polishing her shoes, small daily acts that reinforced her dominance over their bodies and time. These were not just tasks, they were a reassertion of hierarchy after disobedience. Psychological control was layered into every act. The mistress understood that fear of the unknown could be more effective than any beating. Threats were left deliberately vague. If you ever do that again, you won't like what happens, allowing the child's imagination to fill in the worst possibilities. In this way, punishment extended beyond the moment, living in the child's mind and shaping their behavior long after the initial offense. There were also punishments designed to humiliate. A child might be scolded harshly in front of other servants, or even the white children of the house, their shame put on display as a warning. Some were made to wear soiled or ill-fitting clothes for days, the humiliation visible in every interaction. For a child already stripped of autonomy, these public degradations cut deep, eroding any sense of dignity. In the most calculated cases, the mistress would manipulate loyalty and affection as tools of control. She could lavish attention on a child one day, offering sweets, praise, or gentle touches, only to withdraw it suddenly the next as a form of punishment. This unpredictability kept the child in a constant state of tension, never certain whether their actions would bring approval or condemnation. Over time, it taught them to anticipate her moods, to read her expressions, to adjust their own behavior in desperate hope of avoiding the cold withdrawal of favor. Even acts of kindness could be weaponized. A mistress might allow a punished child to rejoin the family meal after days of exclusion, framing it as a reward for good behavior. The child, starved for belonging, might thank her, internalizing the idea that comfort and connection were hers to give or withhold. This cyclical pattern bound the child emotionally to their oppressor, blurring the lines between relief and gratitude, punishment and mercy. Because these punishments took place inside the house, away from the public eye, they were largely invisible to outsiders, even to some members of the enslaved community. The home became a private theater of discipline, where the rules could be bent and reshaped to suit the mistress's will. There was no overseer to report to, no witnesses to hold her accountable. In that isolation, cruelty could flourish in subtle, sustained ways. For the children who endured it, the effects were long-lasting. The fear of sudden separation could linger into adulthood, shaping how they trusted others. The humiliation of public shaming could erode self-worth in ways that no physical scar could show. And the unpredictable shifts between kindness and cruelty could leave them always braced for loss, even in moments of apparent peace. This was the hidden reality of domestic punishment, not the spectacle of violence in the fields, but the steady, suffocating control that reached into a child's mind and spirit. In the world of the plantation household, the walls did not just keep the outside world from looking in, they kept the pain from getting out. Within the plantation hierarchy, few divisions were as consequential for enslaved children as the one between the house and the fields. This separation was not random. It was deliberate, often crafted by the mistress of the house herself, whose personal preferences could shape the course of a child's entire life. To be chosen as a house child was, on the surface, a privilege. It meant avoiding the relentless sun and the back-breaking labor of the fields. House children wore cleaner clothes, ate leftovers from the family table, and moved within the relative comfort of shaded rooms and polished floors. But this comfort came at a cost measured in proximity to the mistress's gaze, in the constant negotiation of behavior, and in the expectation of loyalty that could override one's own family ties. The selection process for house children was deeply personal. Sometimes it was based on perceived beauty, especially features that aligned more closely with white ideals: lighter skin, straighter hair, delicate facial structure. At other times, it was temperament that mattered: a quiet child, an obedient one, a child who smiled when spoken to and never looked away when scolded. The mistress might choose one simply because they reminded her of herself as a girl, or because they were the offspring of someone she favored or feared. In some cases, a child's mixed-race heritage, often the unspoken result of the master's own abuses, played a role in this selection, creating layers of tension and resentment within the community. Once chosen, a house child's life was shaped entirely by the mistress's expectations. They rose before dawn to light fires, prepare the breakfast table, or assist in dressing the family. They learned the quiet skills of domestic service, polishing silver, folding linens, arranging flowers, all under the close supervision of their mistress, who corrected them with a sharp word or a look that could pierce deeper than any slap. But favoritism was a double-edged sword. While house children were spared the grueling labor of the fields, they bore the brunt of the mistress's moods. They were always within reach, always available to be scolded, corrected, or assigned an extra task. In the fields, a mistake might be punished with a whip. In the house, it could be punished with weeks of cold treatment, the silent withdrawal of approval, or a sudden reassignment to the harshest chores. The very closeness that offered safety also meant there was no escape from her authority. This hierarchy extended beyond labor. House children were often dressed in hand-me-down clothing from the white children, marking them as separate from their peers in the quarters. The fabric might be finer, but it also made them targets for envy and suspicion. Other enslaved children might see them as favorites, assuming they had been softened by the comfort of indoor life. In reality, many house children lived in a constant state of tension, caught between two worlds, never fully belonging to the white family they served, yet viewed with suspicion by the enslaved community outside. The mistress could use this division to her advantage. By showing visible favoritism to certain children, she could foster jealousy and competition, ensuring that loyalty to her outweighed loyalty to one another. A smile, a kind word, or a rare gift, a ribbon, a sweet, could bind a child to her, making them more pliable, more eager to please. This dynamic ensured that the mistress remained the central figure in their world, the gatekeeper of both comfort and suffering. In some cases, favoritism extended into adulthood. A favored child might grow into a trusted house servant, eventually taking on responsibilities that brought them into even closer proximity to the family. Personal attendants, seamstresses, cooks. Others might be granted small freedoms or privileges denied to those in the fields. But the inverse was equally true. A fall from favor could be swift and merciless. A single perceived betrayal, a careless word overheard, could send a house servant to the fields or even to be sold, severing them from everything familiar. For the children left in the fields, the mistress's disfavor was often inherited, not earned. Some were never considered for house service simply because of their appearance, their parentage, or a grudge held against their family. They might grow up resenting those who had been chosen, unaware of the hidden costs that came with that choice. The legacy of favoritism was deep and lasting. It taught children that survival could hinge on pleasing a single person, that their worth was measured not by who they were, but by how they were seen. It created divisions that fractured the enslaved community from within, sowing distrust and competition where solidarity might have otherwise grown. In the mistress's world, the power to choose who stayed in the house and who toiled in the fields was not just about managing labor. It was about shaping identities, futures, and relationships. Through these choices, she wielded a quiet but devastating influence, one that reached far beyond the walls of the home and into the lives of those who would carry its scars for generations. As enslaved children grew into adolescence, the control exerted by white women over their lives often shifted from discipline and labor assignments to something even more intimate and irreversible: the control of their reproductive futures. For many young girls and boys, the mistress became not just the overseer of their work, but the architect of their marriages, dictating who they would wed, when, and for what purpose. These arrangements were rarely about affection or companionship. They were transactions, calculated moves designed to serve the needs of the household or the broader demands of the plantation. A favored housegirl might be paired with a strong field hand to ensure the continuation of a productive bloodline. A skilled male servant could be married to a seamstress so that both might remain in close proximity to the big house, ensuring their labor was always within reach. Sometimes these unions were meant to keep valued workers from being sold, tethering them more firmly to the estate by binding their lives and children to it. The process was rarely presented as a choice. The mistress might call a young girl into her room, speak to her in a tone that feigned kindness, and inform her of the match as though it were an honor. The girl would be told who she would marry when the ceremony would take place, often officiated by another enslaved person or occasionally a minister, and what her new duties would be as a wife. Any hesitation or protest was met with cold dismissal, a reminder that refusal was not an option. These marriages often occurred in the mid to late teens, when girls were deemed old enough to bear children and boys were considered capable of providing labor. For the mistress, this was not about preserving childhood or safeguarding innocence. It was about timing reproduction to ensure a steady supply of enslaved labor. Each birth was an addition to the estate's wealth, each child another piece of property that could be worked, traded, or sold. Even in these unions, the mistress's authority did not end. She could dictate where the couple would live, whether they would be allowed to remain together, and how many children she expected them to produce. A wife might be assigned to the house, her husband to the fields, seeing each other only briefly in the evenings. Or the reverse could happen, a deliberate separation meant to weaken emotional bonds, ensuring that loyalty to the mistress or master took precedence over devotion to a spouse. For young women, this control over their reproductive futures extended to the most intimate aspects of their lives. Pregnancy was not always the result of a marital union. Some girls were subjected to the sexual exploitation of white men in the household or visitors to the estate, their marriages used as a cover to obscure paternity. The mistress's role in these situations could be complex and deeply unsettling. In some cases, she ignored the abuse entirely, focusing instead on the economic value of the children it produced. In others, she used the marriage as a means to manage appearances, pairing the girl quickly to a chosen husband to avoid scandal. The emotional consequences for the enslaved youth were profound. Love, attraction, and personal choice, the very things that most people associate with marriage, were often irrelevant in these arrangements. Instead, marriage became another form of servitude, another link in the chain of control. Young couples might grow to care for each other over time, but just as often they lived with resentment, frustration, or quiet grief for the lives they had been denied. Boys and young men were not exempt from this manipulation. Being told whom to marry and when could mean being bound to someone they barely knew, or being separated from someone they loved because the mistress decided a different pairing would yield more desirable children. They were expected to perform the role of husband on command, regardless of their feelings. Refusal could bring punishment, reassignment, or sale. The long-term impact of these arranged marriages rippled outward through generations. Children born of such unions grew up knowing that their parents' relationship was not the result of choice, but of compulsion. They saw their mothers and fathers navigate lives shaped by orders rather than dreams. They understood that even the most personal parts of their existence, their families, their homes, their bodies, could be decided in a room by someone who saw them not as human beings, but as assets. In the hands of white women, adolescent control in early marriage became a potent tool of domination. It was not as loud or visible as the whip, but it was just as effective at binding people to a system designed to strip away autonomy. Through these unions, the mistress ensured that every stage of life, from childhood to adulthood, unfolded under her shadow, and that the next generation would be born into it before they could even imagine another way of living. Though the history of white women's role in slavery is heavy with cruelty, there were moments, rare, fragile moments, when a mistress extended what appeared to be kindness toward the children in her control. A warm meal slipped to a hungry boy before bed. A set of hand-me-down clothes saved for a girl shivering in the early frost. A quiet word to keep a child indoors on a day when the overseer was known to be in a foul temper. But such acts were not simple. In the rigid world of the plantation, compassion toward enslaved children came at a cost to both the child and the woman who offered it. When a mistress chose to shield a child, she was not simply defying her husband or the overseer, she was violating an unspoken code among the white elite. The slaveholding class survived not just through laws and property rights, but through a shared social agreement that the enslaved must remain beneath them in every way. To treat a black child as if they were worthy of comfort, dignity, or affection risked undermining that fragile but essential hierarchy. The consequences for such defiance could be swift. A woman seen as too soft could be mocked or scorned by her peers. Her authority within the household might be questioned, her voice in plantation affairs diminished. Husbands might tighten their control over household decisions, replacing her influence with stricter, harsher measures. Even within her own family, her children could be taught to see her leniency as weakness, or worse, betrayal of her race and class. For the enslaved child, the dangers were even more immediate. Special treatment could make them a target for resentment from others in the quarters, who saw kindness as favoritism. More perilously, it could draw the attention of those in power who wished to stamp out any hint of rebellion or deviation from the expected order. An overseer, feeling that his authority had been challenged, might punish the child more harshly the next time an infraction occurred. A master might remove them from the house entirely, sending them to the fields as a warning to others that compassion had no place in maintaining control. There were women who quietly resisted this system in subtle ways. They might teach a trusted child to read in secret, slipping them scraps of newspaper or the Psalms from a tattered Bible. They might intervene to stop a whipping, fabricating an excuse to protect the child from the lash. A few even took the dangerous step of helping a child escape, using their access to resources and knowledge of the household's routines to create an opportunity for flight. But these acts were rare precisely because the stakes were so high. Every choice to help risked collapsing the delicate balance of survival, for the child, for the woman, for anyone connected to them. And even when such kindness was offered, it was entangled with the reality of ownership. The woman might feel genuine affection for a child, might even think of them as one of her own. But at the end of the day, she still held the power to sell them, punish them, or control every aspect of their life. Her kindness existed within a cage she kept locked. The enslaved children themselves often learned early to navigate this contradiction. They might accept the extra bread, the softer blanket, the reprieve from punishment, but they understood that gratitude could never erase the truth. The same hand that shielded them one day could strike them the next, or sign the order that tore them from their family. This tension gave such moments of mercy a strange, almost painful quality. A rare kindness could make the cruelty of the system cut even deeper, because it proved that another way was possible. And yet, it was denied to most. It left a mark on memory, a ghost of what life could have been if power had not been built on ownership. In the end, these acts of compassion, however sincere, could not undo the structure they existed within. They were fleeting sparks in a vast darkness, brief enough to warm a child's heart for a moment, but never enough to change the cold reality of their place in the world. For the mistress, they were small rebellions, acts of conscience that carried the risk of social isolation or worse. For the child, they were bittersweet, reminders that kindness was possible, but freedom was not yet within reach. The story did not end when the plantations fell silent and the legal chains were broken. The patterns of control that white women wielded over enslaved children left an imprint far deeper than most history books acknowledge, an imprint etched into the very structure of African American family life for generations. The power to decide who a child belonged to, where they lived, whom they married, and even whether they learned to read was not just a matter of the past. It shaped a culture of vulnerability that persisted long after emancipation. Families that had been torn apart by the decisions of a mistress or her peers struggled to reform in freedom. Generations later, the echoes of those broken bonds could still be felt in the fragility of kinship networks, in the way trust had to be rebuilt from the ground up. White women's control of enslaved children was not incidental. It was deliberate, intimate, and daily. And yet, when the history of slavery is told, their role is often minimized or erased entirely. The image of the Southern belle or the devoted wife is preserved, while the record of her as an active enforcer, a gatekeeper of childhood, a hand that shaped futures, is quietly pushed aside. This silence is not accidental. To confront it would mean unraveling a carefully constructed narrative about gender and innocence, one that shields white womanhood from the stains of brutality. It would mean admitting that the power to destroy a life is not confined to the battlefield or the auction block. It can exist in the nursery, the kitchen, the sewing room. And so, in textbooks and public memory, the mistress remains a background figure, her face blurred behind that of the master. But for the children she owned, her presence was anything but distant. She was the voice that called them in from the yard, the eyes that judged their posture and speech, the hand that could grant them a small mercy or condemn them to a lifetime of harder labor. She was the architect of their days and, often the warden of their dreams. The legacy of this power is hard to measure, but it lives on in ways that cannot be denied. It lingers in the stories passed down in whispers, in the unmarked graves of children who never saw adulthood, in the resilience of families who learned to love fiercely because love had so often been stolen. It lives in the gaps of our history, where the truth was too inconvenient to write down. Perhaps that is why, even now, speaking of it feels like breaking a taboo. It forces us to look beyond the neat categories of victim and perpetrator to confront a truth that is harder to hold, that oppression can wear the face of care, that cruelty can hide in the shape of a mother's hand, and that history is rarely as simple as we are taught to believe. The silence is comfortable, the truth is not, and yet if we choose to keep that silence, we inherit it, along with all the damage it was built to conceal. The children of slavery deserve to be remembered in full, not just as the property of men, but as the daily subjects of women who claim to protect the moral fabric of their homes while enforcing its cruelest laws. We cannot undo what was done, but we can decide whether it remains hidden. And in telling this part of the story, in refusing to let it be erased, we make it harder for power, in any form, to hide behind the mask of gentleness again.